Welcome, everybody, to the NeuFit Undercurrent podcast. I'm joined today by Greg Pignataro, who is a strength coach at CSCS in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And part of why we're talking today is to hear his story, where he recently set the world record for the most Nordic hamstring curls in 1 minute. So he is a Guinness Book of World record holder. And also is a certified ATG coach. ATG is Athletic Truth Group, which is founded by Ben Patrick, who most people know from social media as the knees over toes guy. And they use a lot of powerful principles and really good methods. So I'm excited to talk to Greg about all of that here today. Greg, welcome.
Oh, Garrett, thanks for having me.
Heck yeah. So we got connected through Wesley Kress, who is a great practitioner using the Neubie. He actually was one of the first. He got one of the first Neubies off of our first production run. So he's been using it for 5 or 6 years at the time of this recording there in the Phoenix area. And you had worked with him as along the way as part of your prep work for the setting the Nordic Hamstring Curl record, right?
Yeah, he helped me with a very key step of my training for that record. So I'm excited to dive into that with you.
Awesome, awesome. We'll talk about that. So before we go there, let's talk a little bit about your background. So did you play Division I soccer? Is that right?
I did for 2 years. I played Division I soccer at Marquette University in 2008, 2009. And in 2009, I ended up breaking my back, a bilateral spinal fracture during practice. And the recovery process from that was pretty grueling. And I ended up not being able to stay at the same school. So I transferred to a smaller school in Wisconsin called Carthage College, which is where I finished out my soccer career.
Yes, we'll have to compare some notes on the Midwest too. I grew up in the Chicago area, so
Nice. Which
yeah,
suburb?
I grew up. Yeah, that's right. Good question, right? Mostly in the Elmhurst, Oak Brook area out in the western suburbs, but my dad lived in the city, so I was back and forth.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
grew up in the Algonquin area, so we weren't too far from each other at all.
Nice, nice, very good. I love it. I love it. So let's talk about how did you get from having that injury, then transferring, becoming a strength coach, setting the Guinness Book of World Records record here. So kind of just establish the context and walk us through the arc of your career for those 10, 12 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of interesting. It's all wrapped up within the Nordic story because I first heard of the exercise Nordic curls when I was a freshman at Marquette. They wanted us to do them for hamstring training during our preseason training program. And out of a roster of 30 Division I athletes, soccer players with very strong legs, one guy could do 1 rep. That was the cumulative total of the team. And it definitely wasn't me. I was nowhere close. So they actually abandoned having us do this exercise because they were like, this is too hard for them. They can't do it. Let's do something else. So then, soccer career continued, suffered a pretty bad injury my freshman year as well. Sophomore year was when I broke my back, and that rehabilitation process, even though it was really grueling, really mentally taxing, that is kind of when I started to become fascinated with the body, strength, mobility, all of that to try to do your best to reduce the risk of injury, come back from them if they happen, and then make yourself stronger than you were before.
And
So,
and just to be clear,
yeah,
so in your injury, we had a spinal fracture, but no spinal cord injury, right?
correct. No spinal
Okay.
cord injury, luckily,
Yeah.
just a fracture.
Okay.
And so that, like I said, that recovery process was really where I started to get super interested in learning about and ultimately practicing this stuff. But I didn't intend to make a career out of it. I think I studied psychology and business when I was in school, and I entered the corporate world first in the pharmaceutical industry, and could only take so many years of a soul-sucking desk job before I was like, you know what, I'm going to actually try to make a living out of this whole fitness thing. So I worked a variety of jobs for small strength and conditioning coaching, independent places, for a Division III women's soccer team in the Chicago area called North Central College, and then went full-time on my own when I moved out to Phoenix in 2018. And a couple of years after that is when a friend of mine was like, hey, you got to check out this guy on social media called Knees Over Toes Guy. And I was like, okay, no, the name's cool. I like that. Like, I'll check it out. And one of the first videos I saw of him was demonstrating Nordic curls. And the way that he explained how he would teach them to people, because almost nobody can do one their first time, had a lot of parallels with the way that I teach people how to do push-ups. It was starting with a dramatically reduced range of motion, but still maintaining a ton of core stiffness and perfect form, and then gradually increasing the range of motion. So I was like, okay, his method and some of the ones that I use seem to have some overlap there. And I want to finally be able to master this exercise that bested me as an 18 and 19-year-old. So you know what? I'm gonna take a chance on this. I signed up for his program just as a client. And within a month, some of my hip mobility and hamstring mobility was some of the best it had ever been. So I was like, okay, this is worth exploring further. And when they offered a coaching certification, I pursued it and haven't looked back.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And then what inspired you to take the leap to go for a world record?
Okay. So, at first Nordics felt impossible, right? Like I couldn't do a single one, wasn't even close, couldn't even control a full eccentric rep, but I stayed consistent with it. And for about 4 months, I did them once a week. And by the end of that 4-month period, I built up to being able to do a single rep. Wasn't satisfied there, but fell in love with it and kept going. And around this time, I saw a couple videos of professional athletes performing the exercise. There's a famous video of Tyreek Hill doing 10 reps that I think blew up on the internet sometime around 2019 or 2020. And over the course of 2021, I built up my capacity to be able to do about 15 reps. And then I saw a Men's Health article on George St. Pierre. They're talking about watch him dominate this hardest of all lower body exercises. And he did 2 reps. And I was like, dang, okay, like this guy, like, yeah, I know this exercise is hard, but he just got an article in Men's Health for being able to do 2. I was like, I can do a lot more than that now. I was like, what's the world record on this? So I went and looked at Guinness's page and had a bit of a back and forth with them, because they have some fairly they're very specific with their standards on measurability. They want to make sure that everything can be easily tracked and assessed. And if you don't meet their standards for any particular kind of exercise, like they're very diligent about throwing out reps. So after I spoke to them and went through this whole 6-month process on figuring out what the world record would take, I attempted it in December of 2022, so about 3 months ago at the time of this recording, and was able to do 24 reps in 1 minute, and that was enough to set the world record.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's awesome. So what were the criteria then for each rep to count? Was it, chest had to be down, hip flexion or extension at a certain angle, or,
Yep.
What were some of the, so actually, just to be clear too, to set it up for everybody. So we're talking about Nordic hamstring curls where you're, kneeling on the ground and your feet are clipped under, a pad or something. Not talking about the glute ham, the GHD device where, the pad might be on your thighs and you're doing these same type of hamstring curl repetitions. But just to be clear, there is a difference between the GHD, or the glute ham, and the Nordic hamstring curl. So
yeah, correct. And that's a really good point, because the glute ham machine, like you said, allows you to put pressure horizontally on that dome shaped pad with your thighs. And so that gives you a little bit better leverage. So that movement is a bit easier than the Nordic hamstring curl, where with the Nordic hamstring curl, it's just your ankles that are locked in place. So some machines do have a foot plate that let you press against, some don't. It is better if you have one where your feet can press against a foot plate because you get a little bit more force from the first link in the chain. But yeah, so their standards, which are a little bit different. Everybody when it comes to any exercise, like there can be disagreement on what constitutes proper form. So for Guinness, and to prioritize measurability and standardization, they had 4 criteria that you had to meet. So the first one was every rep must start flat at the bottom with your hips and your chest completely touching the pad. You have to keep your hands behind your back so that you can't use your arms for any momentum swing. At no point during the rising portion of the exercise are your shoulders allowed to drop below your hips. You have to keep your shoulders above your hips the entire time. And then to make sure that you go all the way up, you have to touch your glutes to the point at which your ankles are anchored. So those are the 4 standards. And yeah, the categories are most in a minute, most in 3 minutes, most in an hour, and most in a day. And the reason they do it like that is because with Guinness, there's no existing category for body weight exercises that says how many in a row can you do, because that's too difficult to standardize. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, some people listening have probably had the experience of being in a testosterone fueled push-up contest. And then there's this argument like, you can't rest at the top like that, or you can't, you can't lean your hips back like that to rest. And so Guinness says, what, we're not going to deal with any of that. You can rest as much as you want to, but if you rest more than a few seconds in the 1 minute or 3 minute categories, you probably won't get the record. Mm-hmm. And then if you go on to like the hour and the day categories, then rest becomes a key strategic component.
I read a great article on these guys who have gone after the most pull-ups in a day. David Goggins had it at 4,000 something pull-ups, and then I forget the gentleman who's has it now, but 7,000 something pull-ups in a 24-hour period. And the strategizing, the cadence that they use, the rest periods, how to take care of their hands, and is fascinating. Well, you think you might go after any of the other ones as well?
Maybe the 3 minute, but probably not the hour or the day. And I'll get into that in a minute because it actually dovetails quite nicely with how I started working with Wesley. But one key thing too, I know that the Nordic curl is still somewhat of a niche exercise, so it's possible that some people listening to it may not be familiar. So I think one of the best ways to understand the exercise is to think of it as the lower body pull-up, since we're just talking about pull-ups. Pull-ups are measuring, can you control your whole body weight through full elbow flexion? And Nordic curls are measuring, can you control your whole body weight through knee flexion? And in both exercises, the amount of core tension and overall body stiffness that you can generate is very important for doing the move efficiently. So I think that's a really useful framework to look at the exercise.
And also, a lot of people, try to do a pull-up and they can't do one. So they need these various strategies to try to build up to just doing their first one. And then, of course, you can build from there. But same thing with a glute ham. A lot of people will try, with a Nordic hamstring curl. A lot of people will need to use various strategies, holding at the top, doing the eccentric on the way down. Sometimes we've rigged up, for people holding bands, like a backpack, holding bands around the shoulders to help give some assistance on the way down. So there's all these different, just like you would do those machines in commercial gyms where you could stand on the weight that supports some of your body weight while you do pull-ups, all these different.
Totally. And I think the band assistance for the Nordic curls I found to be by far the best tool, because it lets you practice the full range of motion with less than your body weight. Whereas, most people, when they try it for the first time, they try to control that eccentric rep, they get about halfway down, and then their body's gonna detect way too much tension in the hamstrings. Neurologically, they shut off, and then you face plant. Like that's
timber.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of similarities between the two exercises. And another one I've seen with both is that like the journey from 0 to 1 often takes longer than the journey from 1 to 10. And so it's like once you can do 1, if you stay with it, then the rest kind of come pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a good, another really good insight there. So let's circle back now to along the way you're preparing for this record. Obviously, we know the end of the story where you achieved the record, set the record, but then along the way you were working with Wesley for some particular thing that came up there. So can you
Yes.
talk about the work you did with him and how you used the newbie during that preparation process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason why I think I will probably not be pursuing the most in an hour or most in a day category was due to something similar that I attempted in June of 2022, so about 6 months before I set the record. There's a company called Freak Athlete Essentials that makes a mini Nordic bench, which is pretty cool because it's like a nice portable thing and it's more affordable than some of the larger ones on the market. And they had a contest that said if anybody can do 20 Nordic hamstring curls in, or sorry, 100 Nordic hamstring curls in 20 minutes, then they would give them a free Nordic mini. And I was like, all right, cool. This sounds like a contest worth attempting. So I'll go for it. I was successful. I ended up doing it, I think, in about 16 minutes. And I knew after the fact that my hamstrings would be really, really sore. But what I wasn't prepared for was the extreme amount of adductor soreness that I experienced for about the next week. And I also got some irritation on the medial part of my knees, which was a new thing for me. Like I hadn't really had much knee pain since I was a teenager. So that was a little bit alarming. And what was worse was every time I did Nordics thereafter, even like 3, 4 months later, I would that knee pain would come back. And this was something that, in the previous over a year of doing Nordics, I hadn't experienced. And I felt like I was getting a little bit weaker, like I wasn't performing as well, and they were more painful to do. And so this was about the time that I sought out Wesley, and he gave me a really, really good newbie session. So where I brought the Nordic Mini to his clinic, and he applied 4 pads to each hamstring, two at the lower portion, and 2 all the way up on the glutes to get the maximum amount of mechanical tension on the Nordics or on the hamstrings. And after warming up, we performed 3 sets of 8 eccentric only reps, because with the amount of tension used on the newbie, I could only do the rising portion one rep. That's how difficult it was. But at the end of this session, my hamstrings, even though they were exhausted, they felt better than they probably ever had, because they were so thoroughly activated by the current that I had been using hamstring muscle fibers that I probably never had, and not as much of that force was being taken by my adductors and thus by the medial part of the knee joint where one of the adductor muscles inserts. So I felt so much better. And so what I had realized after the fact when I was looking at this was I had done so many Nordic curls in a short period of time to win that contest that my brain started perceiving the angle and the amount of tension on the hamstrings at the bottom of a Nordic curl as a threat. And I was very much aligned with the NeuFit principles here. And so because it was perceiving that threat, it was down regulating the activation of my hamstrings. I was literally getting less hamstring activation doing an exercise that I had previously had no problem with. And so every time I was doing it, I was exacerbating that knee discomfort. And after 2 sessions with Wes and a small tweak to the foot placement on the Nordic curls, the pain completely went away. And I was able to get back to training really, really hard. And a couple months later, set the world record.
That's awesome. I'm so glad that you know that all worked out, and Wes and the newbie were able to help along the way there. And we'll have to get Wesley on. So
Definitely.
if you're listening to this here, Wesley, we'll got to invite you on too. So he actually background is as a doctor of Chinese medicine, and so he does acupuncture. So he's done some work with the newbie and needles, but also super knowledgeable about strength and conditioning. Has competed in powerlifting, and just really, really fascinating skill set, and very knowledgeable in several different areas. So that would
Yeah,
be
he'd be a great guest for sure.
Yeah. So we'll for everyone listening, it's a little foreshadowing. There will be an episode coming up soon, hopefully. Hopefully there. So yeah, Greg, that's awesome. I appreciate you sharing the story there. And let's pivot a little bit and talk about the Athletic Truth Group, ATG, also an acronym for Ass to Grass, right? It
Yes,
works on a lot of levels. I like that.
it does.
Um, so, from what I've seen, I of course follow Ben Patrick, or knees over toes guy. I see your content on social media. I've got on my bookshelf here, read two of Ben's books, and I love the principles of doing full range of motion, of being able to regress and progress all exercises, having balanced activation on muscles, on agonist antagonist muscles on both sides of the joint, working on connective tissue strength, having these standards of competency for basic movements. I mean, there's a loaded mobility work. I mean, just so much about it that I like. So I see a lot of overlap, but I would be very, curious and eager to hear your thoughts on, if there's a Venn diagram of NeuFit over here and what we're doing and teaching, there's ATG over here. Where do you see the overlap, and where do you see the differences? So kind of an open-ended question, but love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a lot of overlap, because one of the things that really clicked for me once I started taking the NeuFit course was how much the ATG principles also really work on using neuromuscular reeducation. Because it started on the surface, it's a knee pain fix system, but it's so much more than that when you dive deeper into it. But one of the key principles that the system operates on is something called short and long range. So it's basically having strength in a position where your muscles are maximally contracted, and also having strength where the muscles are maximally extended. So if we tie it to the Nordic curl, the position where the hamstrings are at their shortest, their most contracted, is your traditional machine hamstring curl. The position where where they're tested when they're the longest is with the Nordic hamstring curl. The hardest position is at the bottom of it when the hamstrings are stretched the most. And so what Ben found is that most training completely neglects loading in those end range positions, in part because in the past, like, it hasn't been considered safe, or there's been very long learning curve in order to get your body comfortable being there. But that once you are able to get into these positions and then develop enough strength to load in them, that leads to dramatically increased injury, or reduced risk of injury, and strength of the tendons and ligaments, which can lead to a lot more force production, lead to a lot better athleticism. So where neuromuscular reeducation comes in is within the ATG system, it's always never working through pain, because we know that downregulates muscle activation, and really doing a bunch of work in the maximally contracted positions in order to maximize blood flow and strengthen the mind-muscle connection, so that you can then progress into some of these more challenging movements. So one of the principles that helped me best understand this was, I think it was research done by that famous Russian exercise scientist Verkhoshansky, who found that strength basically radiates only 15 degrees in either direction. So how strong you are in a 90-degree squat has very little bearing on how strong you are in an ass to grass squat. And conversely, also has very little bearing on how strong you are in one of the key ATG exercises, the reverse step up, where you only bend your knee to about 45 or 30 degrees, and then lock out. So when we understand that, we can see that, okay, we need to get strong in all of these various ranges of motion, and doing that is often going to involve a process of showing the brain which movements, which loads, which ranges of motion are safe, because for the most part, just like nobody can do a Nordic curl at first, hardly anybody can do an ATG split squat with perfect form their first time. except my wife. She was really good at them. I was jealous.
That's awesome. So just for
Yeah,
everybody's reference, so ATG split squat is basically a lunge that looks like a front split. I mean, if you see Greg do it, it's looks like he's virtually in a front split, but instead of the front leg being out, the front leg is in a lunge position with the knee over the toe and the hamstring down on the calf. So there's
yeah,
full knee flexion, right?
exactly. Thank you for clarifying on that. So with these, what we call long range positions, there is that process of showing the brain, hey, like you can trust the body in this position. Like we're strong enough to get into it, we're strong enough to get out of it. But that doesn't come from just like bashing your head against the wall and trying to do the full range of motion your first time. It comes through a very careful, controlled progression system. That's one of my favorite things about ATG is that every single exercise not only has a measurable target for strength that maybe an elite athlete would want to strive for, but it can be regressed all the way back to the version of somebody who hasn't worked out in 10 years could start with. And I think that's where there is a lot of crossover with some of the NeuFit principles, is that it's like, we're trying to work in that productively uncomfortable range to push you, but we're not trying to, go to a 10 out of 10 intensity every time, because that's going to do more harm than good.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about there a few things. I mean, that I really like that we use in the different, obviously the Neubie. I'm sure everyone listening is either uses it or is at least familiar with it, but it's active rather than passive, right? Unlike traditional e-stim where you're just lying down. This is usually being done. So we're stimulating muscles as we move to try to increase activation, to provide the neurological inputs that reduce those neurological protective patterns where the brain and nervous system would limit output of the muscles. So while we're doing movements, a lot of movements that we do, some, so we've added some new ones from seeing, the ATG books and programs, because like you said, you can regress every exercise. So we can make them to where these are some of the really good correctives that we would do even in earlier stages of rehabilitation. And then you can progress and make them more challenging by adding load, by adding range of motion. Then you can use them for performance exercises. But using some of those movements as the corrective exercises that we do in treatment with the Neubie on has been super valuable there. And then one of the things that we talk a lot about is our end range activation movements. So we're trying to get into that bottom of the lunge position and try to pull lower into that position, try to drive that back glute to drive actively into more hip extension. So contracting the antagonist muscles for that same purpose, trying to teach the brain that yes, we have control here, and yes, it's safe here. And I think I know you were going to, like, when you were talking about Yuri Verkhoshansky and some of these things. I think you were going to say that the strength. I don't know if we closed that loop or not, but the strength of those extreme ranges of motion, that transfers much more widely, right? That transfers to the entire range of motion as opposed to isometrics in different positions, right?
Well, that's one of the things I'm not entirely sure on yet. I think there's a lot more transfer when it comes to those end range of motion, particularly to maybe a 90-degree angle. But I've even been surprised that the end range of motion sometimes, depending on the exercise, doesn't translate to the more short range version. That almost has to be built separately. But yes, you're absolutely right that there are more benefits to the end ranges compared to never going into them. No question.
So yes, and there's still benefits to your point about training in short ranges. So one interesting thing at short range. So if I'm trying to contract my bicep, so I'm just doing like a normal bicep curl here, and then if I try to contract my bicep when I'm in shoulder flexion, when my arm's overhead, my bicep is maximally short there because it's shoulder flexion and elbow flexion, and so there's more slack on the muscle spindles, and so there's less kind of reflexive contractile activity, and it takes more central, more down, from the brain, more downward drive, downward signal to contract that bicep. So there are definitely benefits to doing the short range, and that's a big part of it. Is that you really, like you said, mind muscle connection, but that's the mechanism. That's the reason for that. Just for everybody listening, is since there's more slack on the muscle spindle, we have to consciously send a stronger signal in order to get that activation in that position where there's more slack on that muscle spindle mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of touching on what you brought up a couple minutes ago about the lunges and the end range activation, that's one of my favorite things to do with the Neubie with clients when they come to me, because a lot of people find me through the ATG coaches map. And if somebody is struggling to get into the bottom of a ATG split squat, for example, but not because they're having pain, but maybe because of restriction at the ankle or restriction at the hips, applying the Neubie, like applying pads to say their hip flexors, for example, to at a current of 500 pulses per second to get those hip flexor muscles to lengthen and relax. That works so quickly in order to get them comfortable with the range of motion. And then once they can get into it and do a few reps, it's amazing how quickly the brain wakes up and takes notice sometimes, be like, oh, I thought we couldn't get into that position safely, but we just did 10 times and nothing's sore. Great. Like, let's do that from now on. So I've been really impressed with how quickly the Neubie has helped people get into some of these end range positions that sometimes take weeks to months, that you can get there within, a few sessions sometimes because of the Neubie.
That's awesome. That's a great point. And I think that is, a good way to talk about how the two can overlap or work together, because it's sort of in line with something that we often say, which is, if you like to train powerlifting or gymnastics or calisthenics or kettlebells, there's ways you can use the Neubie to help amplify the benefits of what you're doing, by having the ability, one, to work through any of those neurological, those areas where you're going to be holding excess tension as a protective mechanism or limiting output, inhibiting muscles, working through those, and then being able to just preferentially relax and lengthen or contract and shorten certain muscles. So
definitely,
like we were talking about before hitting record, we were talking about, and we'll get into this, talking about the pulsing antagonist work there that you were doing, but the repeated antagonist contraction, that's what you were calling it. So
sounds pretentious, but
but well, it makes sense. We'll let you talk about that. But being able to, like, if you're trying in a lunge, trying to work on hip extension, for example, being able to contract the glute while at the same time you lengthen, you can use the same machine to contract one side and the back part, posterior hip, while lengthening and relaxing the front side. And so, obviously this is a very well thought out progression within ATG. There's a lot of things about it that I really like, and a lot have benefited a lot of people. And I think there's a way to use technology as an accelerator to amplify the effects. Absolutely. And help people achieve those progressions and those milestones and those standards faster.
Absolutely. And I have a really good example on that front too. There's a client I'm working with right now where he and I are both trying to achieve the mobility standard for this, what's called the seated pancake. This is, or maybe people know it as a forward fold. You sit on the ground, your legs are out in a V, and then you try to touch your forehead to the floor. Some people who are a lot more mobile than I am at the moment can get their chest and abdominals to the floor, and that's really impressive. That's the future goal. But this was one that I struggled with for a really, really long time. Part of it was due to soccer. One of the things I found is a little bit of a digression here for all my soccer players out here. We tend to be very weak in hip internal rotation because we spend so much time in hip external rotation, striking the ball when we pass. So we tend to be very weak on the opposite side.
Same for us hockey players.
I believe it. I believe it. And with pancake, hip internal rotation around the pelvis is really important. And if you're restricted there, it won't happen. So one of the things that using the Neubie helps me identify was that hip internal rotation weakness. One of the things that I thought maybe was the culprit is that my adductors weren't able to fully lengthen, or they were too tight. And so I started by applying Neubie pads to my adductors on that 500 pulse per second setting to get them to relax and lengthen. And nothing really changed, but I started to feel an extreme amount of tightness in that hip internal rotation area. And so that was a light bulb moment. I said, okay, this is what I need to focus on instead. And within 2 sessions of applying pads there, to myself, I went from like only being able to touch my elbows to the floor in the pancake position to being able to touch my forehead to the floor after like a 20-minute Neubie session. And the same thing with my client. He wasn't quite there yet. He was starting from a little bit less mobile position, but the amount of progress you can make in getting into these end range positions with the Neubie is phenomenal. And once your body trusts you in them, then you can start to load them, then you can start to move in and out of them freely. And that's when I kind of see it as like unlocking an ability in a video game. It's like once you get there enough times, then the body just trusts you with it.
100%. That's a great way to describe it. And I think life is really a sort of video game anyway. we won't go down that
Next
road,
time.
but yeah. So tell us real quick, since it came up, tell us about the repeated antagonist contraction.
Yeah, so this was a presentation that I gave to the ATG coaches back in February of 2022, and I ended up turning it into something that I presented at National Strength and Conditioning Association conference in December. And it's basically a method to do PNF stretching by yourself. So if anybody is not familiar, PNF stands for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Sounds very fancy, but basically it's various methods. It's a neuromuscular re-education method, right? Like it's getting the body to trust certain ranges of motion and increase your ability to get into certain positions. Typically, it requires a partner, some windows with where you're contracting and relaxing the stretched muscle, or its opposite. And one of the things that I figured out pretty much completely by accident with the couch stretch, which is the one where your leg is back on a chair or the wall and you're trying to stay upright, is that if you repeatedly contract the antagonist or opposite muscle of the one that's being stretched over and over again rapidly, it tends to show the brain much quicker that these ranges of motion are safe, because by being strong enough to exert force on the opposite of the muscle that's being stretched, it increases the tension on the stretched muscle, and then you're more able to load and stretch that muscle further. So one of the benefits I found of this muscle or this method compared to regular PNF stretching is you can do it by yourself and it's a lot less complicated. So I brought it to my clients, everybody loved it, saw progress pretty quickly. And then when you add it to the Neubie, it just accelerates it even more dramatically. Because like you said earlier, you can have one muscle being lengthened on one side, and then you can have the antagonist constantly contracting, which is very difficult, I would say impossible to do on your own without the technology to that degree. So it's a wonderful tool.
Awesome. Yeah. 2 accelerators in one there.
Yes, exactly.
I like it. Well, this is awesome, Greg. I appreciate you sharing your experience in achieving a Guinness World Record, and then also being able to talk shop here and hear your perspective on ATG. Just really excellent work and how it can pair well with the Neubie. So I'm really grateful we got to have this conversation here today. And as we wrap it up here, I want to give you a chance to certainly share any last thoughts, and also please be sure to let people know where to find you. So best places, between website, obviously I know we interact on Instagram and you're on there, but what are the best places for people to find you and see what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm super grateful to be part of this, and this was a lot of fun.
Heck yeah.
And so in terms of where to find me, so my Instagram is probably where I'm most active. So that's at Never Past Your Prime, all one word. That is also my website, www.neverpastyourprime.com.
Awesome. And he's got good educational content on there on social media, so definitely worth a follow. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate, and love hearing these examples of how things are going with you. So we'll definitely stay in touch. Hope to stop by and see you the next time I'm in Phoenix as well.
Absolutely, that would be awesome. Thank you so much again.
Heck yeah. Thank you, Greg, and thank you everybody for tuning in to this episode of the Undercurrent Podcast.